just out of curiosity, how many of you have already heard or seen or know something about this particular piece of work?
I have read the paper.
Okay. I spoke to Gallo. He said he saw the presentation. Okay, so if there are some of you who still didn't, then it still makes this a useful thing to share. I wanted to do both the Kai papers, but just didn't really have enough time to get a hold of the other slide deck, so I'm just going to do this one for now. I'm guessing you can all see my screen, right? Yes, okay. All right, so this one here is about the role of metaphorical representation of agents in conversational crowdsourcing. And I'll try and break this down. So I think most of us here are familiar with what conversational crowdsourcing is, but just for the benefit of others who might be tuning into this later on as well, the context of conversational crowdsourcing is one that uh, was loosely born a few years ago in different lines of research, but we really coined it through some of our earlier work, right? Zihang, who was a former PhD student in our lab and graduated his PhD dissertation was titled Conversational Crowdsourcing. And we were exploring how we could move away from the conventional way in which crowd work was completed, where you'd use conventional web interfaces, present instructions to crowd workers and tasks to crowd workers in a unilateral fashion where they could pick it, read instructions, and consume those tasks, complete them. Uh, Towards this new space where you could actually have a dialogue and there could be some turn taking between an agent that was presenting the work and crowd workers who were completing the work. So that was the paradigm shift that we were trying to harp on, and that new form of doing it is what we refer to as conversational crowdsourcing. All right, so I think some of us over here may be aware of uh, the conceptual metaphor theory, but in general, the conceptual metaphor theory was one that was proposed by Lakoff and Johnson, and it talks about people's understanding of a complex and abstract system and how that usually pans out, right? So when you're dealing with complex constructs, you often would benefit from abstracting away from that complexity into a space of familiarity or less complexity just to digest that information, right? That's something that we do at a subconscious level quite often. But this was a theory that came to fore to try and explain how metaphors can be used as how well humans use metaphors in a lot of different contexts and how this helps with understanding different contexts, right? So one of the famous examples is that metaphor of time is money, right? You probably heard about this, where people try and understand the notion of time in terms of more well-known and tangible concepts like that of money, right? All of us are very familiar with that. So just like you can spend money, just like you can steal money or you can save money, you can also spend time, you can steal time, you can save time. But as some of us also know, we can also waste time, right? So it's pretty nice how powerful an instrument like a metaphor is in understanding complex constructs. So the idea over here again, and Gowla has been working on this a fair bit in the context of analogies. You basically are trying to take something from your source domain that you're pretty familiar with and paint that onto a target domain that you're probably less familiar with, right? Uh, so one of the other famous examples that I'd like to share with you guys is the context of HCI, right? When you think about interfaces that have evolved over so many years in the past few decades, and people have started interacting with computer systems, one of the earliest metaphors that came to fore was in trying to explain to the average layperson what a computer actually is, right? Um, and to do so, the metaphor that started doing the rounds is the computer is a desktop metaphor, right? Right now, for us, it sounds strange to even think of it, but you can imagine if you teleport yourselves back a few ages that people had no clue what a computer is, right? And the best way to explain to an average person what a computer is was to say, hey, it's much like what you would find on your desk, right? It's your desk has a bunch of files and there's probably a folder, right? And there are all these things that you compartmentalize on your desk. And now you can put all of these things into this machine that's a computer that can help you organize all of your information, right? So people started using the computer as a desktop as a metaphor, in which I think many of us who were born in ages beyond the desktop age and in the ages of tablets and laptops and all sorts of other more fashionable devices might find this to be quite interesting and strange. But there was a time when a desktop didn't necessarily refer to a computer right away, and there was actually a desk in your things on top of your desk, right? And that's what informed referring to a computer as a desktop, right? So here's an image of what you could potentially find on a desktop, and transporting that to refer to a newfound computer. Much like this, when designing conversational agents, Microsoft Office, for example, back in the day, uh, helped creating an agent that could potentially assist users in finding different ways of using Microsoft Word itself, right? So they came up with this thing that some of you probably have seen before. Has anyone ever seen this before? Do you know what this is?
I think this is for attachment.
Yes, so there's a pin, right? And Microsoft came up with a design for an agent that was inspired by this, right?
Mr. Clippy.
It's the Clippy, indeed, right? So this one, it looks like you're writing a letter. Would you like help, right? So there's one of those dialogue bots that asks you if you need any assistance and can point you in the right direction if you do need it. So what they did do was they anthropomorphized it by giving it eyes and eyebrows. And this is a design choice, right? So when designing a conversational agent that assists users in tools like this one, Microsoft Word, it is an explicit design choice that you can make to decide whether the uh, metaphor you want to use is one that's in this context of work where you're clipping information or clipping papers together, right? And because of the fact that it's having a dialogue with users, back in the day, the design choice that was made was, why don't we just anthropomorphize it by attaching eyes and expressive eyebrows so that this could make it more engaging. So that was the rationale back then. And ever since, people have been using such metaphors in different contexts, right? So you've probably come across Duolingo, where there's this agent called Duo, right, which is probably a bird. In other contexts, like Nintendo's Animal Crossing, you have all kinds of animals that show up, and they often have they're anthropomorphized, right? So you have eyes, they have noses, mouths, and they speak, right? So you're sort of trying to take those characteristics that characterize humans and human conversations and transpose them onto different inanimate objects or animals and other beings, right? You also have agents like Microsoft's Day. That's a story that we don't have to dig too deep into. It wasn't one of their proudest moments, but well, Tay also has an appearance much like a human would. This is Pandora Bot's Cookie. Again, Cookie is an anthropomorphized agent, looks much like a woman, right? So you can clearly see where the inspiration behind these designs are from. Now, I mentioned Lakoff and Johnson earlier on, and their very influential conceptual metaphor theory. A little while later, Lakoff teamed up with Mark Turner, and they wrote this inspiring book called More Than Cool Reason, right? And in this particular book, they came up with identifying the great chain of being as an instrumental conceptual metaphor framework, right? So what they revealed was, or their theory that they built was tracing all of this back to the Greek philosophers in the ancient times of Aristotle and Plato, right? Where they were arguing that the great chain of being is an unconscious cultural model that's indispensable to our understanding of ourselves, of our world, and our language, right? So they argued that this whole framework consists of 5 entities, those of God, humans, animals, plants, and inorganic objects. And this hierarchical structure that they proposed was implying that entities that correspond to a higher level of the great chain of being have all the qualities that the lower levels possess, in addition to their own distinct quality, right? So let's walk through this chain to explain that a little bit. So apparently, at the highest level of God, God has all the qualities that the other entities that correspond to the other levels do, plus God has God's own distinct qualities, right? Now, when you go to human probably has all the qualities that you would associate with the other levels, plus the human's own distinct qualities. Similarly with animal, plant, and the lowest rung is that of inorganic objects, right? So that's essentially the framework. And how you could use this or how you can understand it is that the great chain of being allows people to understand someone, right? In this example, you have Achilles, a human, with their schematic knowledge of an animal, in this case, a lion, right? So if I was to say Achilles is a lion, what I'm implying with that transposition or that metaphor is that I'm trying to emphasize the bestial power of Achilles through the understanding that you have of lions, right? And through your own impression of what a lion is capable of. So that's essentially how this framework can be used or can explain metaphorical usage of concepts, right? Similarly, if I was to take this into the context of conversational agents, you could probably have some random black box, but by anthropomorphizing this or giving it features or characteristics that you're familiar with from other domains, you could essentially transpose that onto this, black box, right? So you can say that, hey, this conversational agent is now a woman, and therefore everything that you'd potentially associate with a woman at a subconscious level would probably be something that you would ascribe to this agent, right? Note that a lot of these things happen at a stereotypical subconscious level, but sometimes there's also something that can explicitly be triggered, right? So if you were to take each levels of the great chain of being, it's interesting to see how this could potentially affect the perception of end users, right? So if I was to move this away and say, well, this conversational agent is not a woman, but now an animal, with that from saying it's a woman to a bear, would that change something? Or if I was to say, well, it's not a bear anymore, this conversational agent, this black box that you've been staring at, is not a bear, it's a tree, would that change something, right? So what we've observed through the ages is that people have made design choices in isolation, right? So when Microsoft picked up Clippy, uh, we don't really know whether, they explored the possibilities of all kinds of other alternatives, such as looking at animals or looking at anything else, and what exactly would that potentially do or mean for the end user, right? And as I started off by saying that we're interested in the context of conversational crowdsourcing, in this piece of work, we wanted to see, well, if we are using conversational agents to create these engaging environments for crowd work to be accomplished, shouldn't we be informed about our choice of how we can design these conversational agents, right? Shouldn't we really understand the landscape of possibilities and how our design choices could have impacts on end users? Because at the end of the day, you're using a conversational agent. And now you're making a design choice of what that conversational agent should appear like, right? And you're, giving it a name, shape, a size, and, maybe even a personality to some extent. And all of those things could potentially affect downstream impressions, but we don't fully understand how that looks or works. Or does that even make a difference, right? In the context of conversational crowdsourcing, where there are a lot of people who are just there to accomplish work and earn some money, as Garrett was also painting out through his earlier talk. How does all of this pan out, right? That's the big question. So to find that out, we adopted this lens of conversational microtask crowdsourcing. I explained what this potentially is. And in some of our earlier work, right, we found that the conversational interface improved the perceived worker engagement, and also led to a significantly higher worker retention while maintaining the same sort of output quality, right? So moving from there, we posed and formulated this research question where we said, well, how do different metaphorical representations of a conversational agent impact worker engagement, perceived cognitive load, intrinsic motivation, and trust itself in this conversational microtask crowdsourcing paradigm? In this study, we recruited participants from Prolific, which all of you are familiar with, and we introduced them to one of 6 metaphors for the conversational agent that they could eventually interact with. And we considered 2 different task types, one of information finding, another one with image classification, and subjects were randomly assigned to one of these 6 metaphor conditions. We had a control condition that would allow us to understand the effects of all the other metaphors, and then you have the great chain of being framework in there. So you have a condition with God, where the agent was God, where the agent was a human, was an animal, plant, and an inorganic object. Now, each of them had 2 different task types, right? And this led to an elaborate experimental design of 6x2 factorial design, leading to 12 experimental conditions. And eventually we had a post hoc set of questionnaires that workers had to respond to, right? So to give you a peek into the actual tasks and what it looked like, some of you are now familiar with birds. Maybe an ode of thanks to Agat for introducing the joy of birds into our group. Now you see them everywhere. So we looked at the beak classification of birds as one of the tasks, right? And this is the conversational interface, where in one of the interfaces you see an agent without an avatar, right? So you just have the agent speaking, and in the other case there is an avatar. I'll explain a little bit more about how we assign specific images and how we zeroed in on specific animals and inorganic objects, but I'll get down into that. Here's just a quick peek into the different tasks. So earlier on, it was the image classification task, where the objective for the workers was to identify what the type of the beak was and classify that into different categories. And over here, the objective was for workers to find the taxonomic classification of particular birds, right? So they were, I think, assigned the name of the bird or some details about the birds, and workers had to go onto Wikipedia and try and retrieve what the scientific taxonomic classification was. So this is an information finding task. In that same breath, we control the metaphor sampling. I was, mentioning, hey, there has to be some well-informed way of assigning specific roles to each of these metaphors, right? So if I was to say animal, now you guys could, say, well, why did you pick a dog or a bear instead of a cat or a panda, right? And to make a meaningful choice, a meaningful design choice as to what's the right animal to use or what's the right inorganic object to use, we relied on the stereotype content model. Let me speak a little bit about this because it's super interesting and might be relevant for some of us as we move along. So the stereotype content model is a model that allows you to look at different concepts across 2 different axes, right? One of them is that of warmth, and the other is that of competence. And if you were to look at these 2 axes and then think of it as a 2-dimensional space, where exactly would different concepts that we know fall if you were to think of them as quadrants on these 2 axes, right? Here's an example that you can see on your screens with what I hope many of us are familiar with, the Harry Potter universe, right? And this is our individual take. It's subjective, you might disagree, but it's presented over here to provide it as an example. Now, if you were to think of Hermione, right, you might associate her with being highly competent. She's also quite warm, right? So she'd probably fall into that quadrant. And then you have Neville Longbottom, who often comes across as being extremely warm, but it's especially in the earlier stages of the stories, probably not all that competent, right? He was a butt of many a joke in the beginning. And then you have this quadrant of people being low on competence and warmth. Again, this sort of changes. Draco Malfoy became more competent as the series prolonged, but arguably you could put him into that. Many would disagree, but the point is you could associate individuals across these two axes of uh, warmth and competence, and the feelings they evoke in you when you think about them, right? And I think all of us would probably agree with Lord Voldemort. He should not be named, would fall into this last quadrant of being low on warmth but high on competence, right? So the broad idea really with the stereotype content model is, what is the stereotype that you'd associate with a concept across these two axes, right? So I went through that explanation, and long story short, what we did was we sampled a diverse set of metaphors in the space of competence and warmth, and zeroed in on these which fell into appropriate quadrants of high warmth and high competence. Why? Well, because you as a designer, you would never want to come up with an agent that has low warmth and low competence, correct? You would never want to have, well, you'd want to, the desirable quadrant to be in is the high warmth and high competence quadrant, because you want your users to be engaged. You want your users to perceive the agents as being capable of helping you out, right? So that's the only quadrant we zoomed into, but we sampled a whole range of metaphors, uh, crowdsourced this, and tried to see which ones were most were perceived as being most warm and competent, right? And this is what we arrived at. So God, well, you can't really play around with that. So we didn't want to break God down into the religious divides of how people look and perceive God. So we decided to just, think of God as this one universal notion that anyone could then relate to depending on their own religious faith or not, if they didn't. Then humans, we tried, we leaned on related work that explored the stereotype content model as well, and trained professionals through such work were found to be in this quadrant of high warmth and competence. Through our pilot explorations, we found that animals, within the animals spectre, we found that dog was perceived to be the most warm and competent. When it came to plants, it was avocado, and with inorganic objects, it was books, right? So these were the 6 different concrete experimental conditions that we had. And here's a small peek into how we, built a narrative around each of these conditions, right? Because now you have God, you have a human, you have an animal, a plant, or an inorganic object. It's either a dog or a book or an avocado, right? That's speaking with these crowd workers. So as opposed to just letting the picture do all the talking, we also wanted to build some context around it to really drive that metaphor home, right? So to paint that picture, let's walk through some of these examples and the opening greetings. And so while the tasks themselves were completely identical across these different conditions, the way that they were introduced and the persona of the agent was different to convey that metaphor a bit more, right? So God was saying, oh, I'm the Lord, thy God. You shall help researchers at a university by participating in this research. So I ask you, does this sound good to you, right? And then there's a human, hello, pleasure to meet you. I'm a trained professional who'll guide you here. Researchers in a university asked me to facilitate this research. Does it sound good to you? The dog says, woof, woof, nice to meet you. I'm a dog that'll help you conduct this research, right? And the plant says, well, hello, nice to meet you. I'm an avocado that will help you conduct this research. But if you look at the corresponding agent narrative as well, we built that in. Look at the avocado, it says, they asked me to help you because I'm full of healthy nutrition and I can nourish you throughout this task, right? The dog says, well, they asked me to help you because I'm super good at finding stuff. And this was especially useful in the context of information finding, right? Of course, we didn't tie it down to each task, but that makes sense. In the inorganic object section, you can see that the book is saying, they asked me to help you because I'm full of information and knowledge, right? So we constructed these narratives to sync with what these objects were and pander towards the broader metaphor that they were trying to relate to. Long story short, you can read the paper if you want to look at the fine print. We found that there were a few significant results across the dimensions of worker engagement, intrinsic motivation, and the perceived cognitive task load, right? So no matter what metaphor was used, there was no difference in the perceived trust. There was no effect on the output accuracy, which is consistent with what we found earlier on. And there was no real effect on the task execution time. But depending on what metaphor was used, people did get engaged to different extents. They did experience varying intrinsic motivation, and they also experienced different levels of cognitive load, which is interesting. Again, I'll point you towards the paper if you want some of the finer details, but on the top of your screens, you can see that the overall result that was shown to be significantly different varied. This isn't, a slide that I particularly like, but it's what we have. So I would rather not have these complex plots. I don't want you guys to start digging those out now. But the message really is that the object metaphor, that of book, uh, was found to relate to a significantly lower engagement score and aesthetic appeal compared to that of the dog metaphor. And we can sort of imagine why, right? Uh, I think the animal just has a greater extent of anthropomorphization in this particular envisionment that could perhaps be why there was a greater aesthetic appeal. And you see that missing with the book. In a similar vein, the object metaphor also received lower interest enjoyment scores, which is a subscale of the intrinsic motivation scale compared to the human and animal metaphor. We also found that it resulted in lowering the perceived cognitive load compared to the other metaphors, right? So although it wasn't highly aesthetically appealing, this object metaphor of book, it was perceived as being less complex. It helped communicate, or it had lowered the barrier of load when users were engaging with this conversational agent rather. When it came to the God metaphor actually resulted in a lower perceived usability than the control condition, without any other real significant results. We found that the God metaphor also led to a higher cognitive task load than the object metaphor and the condition where there was no metaphor used, right? So all of this is a little difficult to digest in a nutshell, right? We found varying effects of different metaphors. And what this essentially points out, and if there's one takeaway I'd like all of you to leave this with, it is the fact that this is a world of trade-offs, right? There is no one golden metaphor that you can use that will just work magically for everything. So the real point over here is that there's a trade-off of choosing one level of metaphor for representing a conversational agent in a given context, right? So as opposed to just saying, hey, I'm going to take a metaphor or take a conversational agent, slap a face onto it, pop a couple of eyes into that, and give it a nose so it can breathe, and a mouth so it can talk, maybe more thought has to go into which metaphor you're using and why, depending on the context, right? So unlike previous findings, where higher anthropomorphization and creating a greater level of human likeness was shown to be beneficial, in our work, which I think is the first one that comprehensively panned out the different levels of metaphors and compared them in a controlled context, we found that this isn't always the case, right? So it's not that just creating a metaphor and anthropomorphizing it would just lead to constantly comparable findings, right? So more thought has to be put into this. As for a design implication, what we found was that in the context of conversational crowdsourcing, adopting the animal metaphor or not giving any metaphorical representation was the most beneficial. One of the reasons why this could be is that, well, the animal metaphor was probably more engaging and was probably the most natural way of anthropomorphizing non-human entities, right? Because animals do have eyes and a nose and a mouth. One of our explanations could also be that people are more aware of these, or they're just more familiar with such metaphorical representations, which are then anthropomorphized as opposed to some of the other levels. Or you're better off without using a metaphorical representation altogether, right? In earlier work, we found that it leads to greater engagement, but then what is the type of the metaphor that you're using is also quite important in determining the outcomes. So just to, make sure we know what the main takeaways are with each of these. When it came to the object metaphor, we found that it could be used to lower the cognitive load. When it came to the God and plant metaphor, we really found that there were no perceivable benefits of using these in the context of our work, right? So what are our broad conclusions? If we were to summarize all of this, our contribution can be charted out in 3 different ways. We found evidence that there are trade-offs in using metaphors from different levels, right? And we use this framework and introduce this framework of the great chain of being to do this. We proposed a method to systematically analyze that metaphor space by adopting the great chain of being framework. And as I said, this is the first ever piece of work to do that systematically with conversational agents. We chose the context of conversational crowdsourcing as a lens to explore all of this. And I think this essentially enriches the current discourse on the metaphorical understanding of conversational agents, right? So that's what I had to share with you, and I'd be super happy to hear your thoughts or questions and how this might relate to some of the ongoing work or not.